Rust, a multiplayer survival game. Terraria, a 2D sandbox adventure, and Skyrim, an open-world RPG. These are all very different games, but all have one important thing in common that Bungie could learn from to improve Destiny 2, that is, their progression systems. Progression, by definition, is the process of developing or moving gradually towards a more advanced state. Rust, Terraria, and Skyrim are all games with much better progression and loot systems than Destiny 2. In all of these games, you start very weak, but as you play through the game, you acquire large amounts of loot, similar to Destiny 2. But unlike Destiny, the loot in these games is actually worth going after. That is because there is a large power difference between an endgame player and a fresh character. In other words, there is a large process of developing a character into a more advanced state. In Rust, a fresh character does not even have clothes on his back, but an endgame player has a heavy machine gun and full suit of armor and is powerful enough to take on everything the game can throw at him. In Terraria, you go from barely being able to explore caves without dying to being able to melt bosses in seconds. In Skyrim, you start as a nobody prisoner, but in the game ruling a province and being able to literally shout dragons out of the sky. And then, in Destiny 2, you start as an immortal guardian with access to all of his powers and some guns that are not the best, but within a few hours of playing the game, you have weapons decent enough to carry you all the way through the game, and the only thing stopping you from doing endgame content is an arbitrary number in your inventory screen. Then, after you beat the game, the only difference from a character with 100 hours played and 10 hours played is that the endgame player looks cooler and has weapons that do slightly better than the player with 10 hours completed. After spending all that time to only be marginally better than a fresh player, you have to ask, is it really worth the grind? I mean, think about it. Players can use common, uncommon, and rare weapons reasonably well in all activities as long as the gear's power level is high enough. And obviously there are benefits to certain weapons, but the benefits are very marginal and do very little to make your character actually more powerful than they were at the start of the game. Now, if you compare this to a game I mentioned earlier called Terraria, if you use armor that greatly increases your magic stats and grind for high tier magic weapons, you are substantially more powerful than you would be at the start of the game. In Terraria, it is next to impossible to beat the game with your starting weapons. Honestly, it's almost impossible to beat the first boss with your starting weapons. This gives players an actual incentive to grind for gear, not because it boosts a single number that determines if a player can do an activity or not, but because in Terraria, grinding gear actually makes you substantially more powerful. Destiny 2's progression system is more focused on boosting a single number on your character that determines if your character can participate in in-game activities. A player's power level acts more as a time gate than progression system, as a player does not become any stronger by increasing the power level, because while being underleveled for an activity affects you greatly, overleveling content offers almost no benefit. The only other progression found in the game is players choosing to grind for weapons that only do slightly better than the weapons you earn within the first hour of the game. This is a major issue within the game as players feel their time is not rewarded because it takes a perfect roll of perks on a weapon to actually see a substantial improvement over other weapons. And getting a perfect roll is extremely hard because for most loot in the game, there is no way to target specific rewards, which means players typically have to endlessly farm activities for the loot they want, which is a lot of work for weapons that are barely an improvement over players' current loadouts. And while most loot in Destiny 2 is not very exciting, Bungie has proven that they can make powerful weapons worth playing for. This is shown in many exotic weapons, which offer unique and powerful perks. The only issue is Bungie has made exotics extremely easy to get that only a few cannot be earned by a casual player who logs on once a week. I mean, Bungie literally gives every new character a quest for the exotic SMG known as the Risk Runner at the end of the tutorial, and Bungie gave out the only exotic armor that was released in Shadowkeep to everyone who beat the story missions. The issue with doing this is that it makes grinding for the perfect set of armor and weapons largely pointless, as you only end up being marginally better than a random player who logs on for a few hours every week. So how should Bungie fix this? Well, to start, Bungie should make substantially more white, green, and blue pieces of gear, and players should be getting gear of this caliber until they get to the maximum power level of the season. Then, when players get to the maximum power level, they should receive a Chalice of Opulence like item that allows players to specify what kind of gear drop they want, what element it will be, and what stat the weapon masterwork / armor will focus on. Bungie should also rework how perks work on weapons. Basically, white weapons should have access to no perks besides barrel options, similar to how they are currently. Then green gear should get one perk column that rolls green tier perks. Then blue gear should get access to another perk column that rolls blue tier perks in addition to a green tier perk column. And then legendaries should have a third legendary tier perk column. Each column of perks should offer 2 options so players have more options with each weapon. All of the current perks in the game should be put into the green and blue tier perk pools. And then Bungie should create new extremely powerful perks that are close to what certain exotics offer today, and exotics going forward should be even more powerful. This system gives the power level an actual purpose, as it determines how good of perks players can receive on their weapons. This system also then rewards players' time with actual increases in their character's ability to deal with challenges within the game. So, to quickly recap how I believe the weapon progression should work. Players should gradually go through the different tiers of weapons every season until they reach the power cap. Players then receive a buffed version of the Chalice of Opulence and receive legendaries from that point forward, which are more powerful than those currently in the game. The power grind should also be tweaked so that instead of having a few weekly sources of powerful drops, all activities should reward power increases at the start of the season. Then as you increase in power, fewer and fewer activities drop power increases. This way players are not forced to play activities they do not wish to play. Armor progression also needs some fine tuning to help differentiate in-game armor from the leveling armor you get at the beginning. But the changes I am proposing for armor are nowhere near as drastic as with weapons. Basically, I think every armor set should have set perks similar to how the Gambit Prime armor sets work. For those who do not know, every Gambit Prime piece of gear contributes points towards a set of perks, and having a full set of Notorious Gambit gear gives players all of the perks. I think all armor sets should have set bonuses like the Gambit Prime armor. These set bonuses would encourage players to grind for new armors that have been released, as they would then get access to new perks that would be useful in different scenarios and activities. This to me seems like a definite thing that Bungie could add, as they basically already do it with the Gambit Prime armor, and since they're adding transmog armor pieces in the fall, players will no longer have to worry about what armor looks like, as they can just put on whatever armor mods they want to look however they please. Also, I know at least one person watching will be wondering how I think this should affect Crucible, specifically with the weapons. And to answer that, I think that different modes should have different tiers of weapon perk columns enabled. For example, Mayhem would have all perk columns enabled, as would Iron Banner. Then Competitive would only have the uncommon and rare perk columns enabled on weapons. Bungie would have to play around with each mode to determine which perk columns should be enabled in which different modes. This way, Bungie can control what perks they have to balance for Crucible and for what modes, and this would allow Bungie to keep their most powerful perks without needing to nerf them. Crucible is a tricky thing to balance within Destiny, and I believe much of the progression systems and loot within this game is negatively impacted because Bungie refuses to drastically balance Crucible separately from the PvE side of the game. But anyways, that is how I think Bungie should revamp the progression and loot systems in Destiny 2, so that players are actually rewarded for their time with more powerful pieces of gear. And if you like the video and want to see more like it, please subscribe so you don't miss another video, and until next time, goodbye.